Hello, my name is Alan Ross, and I'm Director of Theater at San Antonio College. I want to invite you to join me on a journey that spans a century and ranges over some of our fair city's loveliest terrain. Come with me now as we examine the growth and development of the neighborhoods that surround the San Pedro Park, an area which now encompasses the San Antonio College campus. The San Pedro Springs rises in central Bexar County and then flows south 2 miles to the San Antonio River. The historic marker tells us that the surrounding area was dedicated in 1729 as public lands by King Philip V of Spain, making this the second oldest municipal park in the United States, the oldest being the Boston Commons.
In the early 1870s, Southern poet and scholar Sidney Lanier described San Antonians' favorite spot for a Sunday outing in the country. Here, under a white-ledged rocky hill, burst forth 3 crystalline springs which quickly unite and form the San Pedro Creek, with spreading water oaks, rustic pleasure buildings, promenades along smooth shaded avenues between concentric artificial lakes, a race course, an aviary, a fine Mexican lion, a bear pit, a wolf, a coyote, and other attractions. This is a very green spot indeed in the prairies. Public transportation in San Antonio began in 1878 with a mule-powered car pulled between Alamo Plaza and San Pedro Springs, the only place outside the downtown area that generated enough passengers to merit building a street railway. Electric power replaced mule power in 1890. On this 1909 map of San Antonio, published by Jules Appier, we can see that the trip from the heart of town to the park was quite a bargain at 5 cents a ride. Following the organization of the San Antonio Traction Company in 1898, the car barns at the terminus of Alamo Plaza and San Pedro Springs line were located at the corner of Dewey and San Pedro Avenue, where McQuillis Hall on the San Antonio College campus now stands. Power was generated in the central powerhouse and came over the trolley wires. The streetcar lines provided transportation for most of San Antonians until buses were introduced in 1933. As the city grew, the proliferating streetcar lines operated in competition with each other, although all were owned by the San Antonio Traction Company. Each had promotional projects to generate business for their line. The San Pedro Electric Park, south of the Springs at Evergreen and Nixon, was one such stellar attraction. Excess electricity from the Traction Company's central generators supplied power for the amusement park. Of course, electricity was still something of a novelty then. Expanding streetcar service also encouraged real estate developers, who began in 1890 to encircle the city with residential additions. Safety was also a factor. The so-called Indian menace prevented development of the city beyond the compact central core. The capture in 1886 of the infamous Apache chief Geronimo and his band and their confinement in the quadrangle at Fort Sam Houston, along with the decline of the outlaw and road agents, allowed unfettered development of the outlying suburbs without fear of harassment. High ground above the San Pedro Springs was an especially attractive locale. Geologically interesting, the bluff at the corner of West Dewey and San Pedro is one of the many points of uplift or separation between the coastal plains and the higher Edwards Plateau. The fault, known as the Balcones Escarpment, exposed the rocky cliffs and gave outlet to the springs nearby. Tobin Hill, Laurel Heights Place, Alta Vista, Beacon Hill, the names of the residential developments in the area remind potential purchasers that this is high ground with a fine view and prevailing breezes from the Gulf of Mexico. Prosperous and prominent San Antonians such as Judge Leroy Denman and Colonel Augustus Belknap began to build impressive homes in the area. Alas, both of these landmark structures have been razed.
At the northwest corner of Dewey and Belknap, the house that we now know as the Bennett House was originally built in 1898 for the banker W. W. Lipscomb. W. Conklin and Atlee Ayers were the architects. This house and the land originally cost $7,500.
Before a fire destroyed the roof in 1926, the house had a more distinctive appearance. In 1912, the property was acquired by the John Bennett family, who built a second residence to the west, also designed by Atlee Ayers. Several generations of the Bennett family lived in these 2 houses until 1975, when the property was purchased by San Antonio College. The structures are now utilized by the music and the radio, television, film departments. Examples of adaptive reuse of historic structures. Another example is the residence at 312 West Cortlandt, also designed by Ayres and built in 1918 for the Russell and Meriwether Hughes family. It was acquired in 1965 by the San Antonio Archdiocese and serves the Catholic campus ministries for all area colleges and universities. The residence at 201 Belknap that Atlee Ayres built for his own family is a romantic example of the architectural eclecticism so prevalent all over the U.S. in the early 20th century. An English half-timber cottage with small window panes. It is a little bit of everything. The reference is to fashion, certainly not to regionalism. As the Ayres house was completed, across the street construction was in progress on one of the showplaces of San Antonio, the house of Otto Koehler. This beer baron's home was described in a 1901 newspaper account as a perfect palace and a picture in dressed limestone. The Koehler residence at 310 West Ashby is situated on one square block, bounded to the north and east by Ashby and Lewis Streets, and on the south and west by Cortlandt and Belknap. The pride of Tobin Hill. The house stands just beyond the southern boundary of the Monte Vista Historic District. This construction photograph, made with a Kodak bullseye camera, shows that the house is firmly rooted in the rocky outcrop on which it stands. The real estate agents involved with the development of this area reminded potential clients that a wise man builds his house upon a rock. Otto Koehler was born in Altfeld, Hanover, Germany on April 28, 1855, and received his education in the seminary school of Altfeld. Immigrating to the United States in 1872, he settled in St. Louis and soon found employment with the firm of Griesedijk Brothers Brewers. Mr. Koehler came to San Antonio in 1884 and was one of the organizers of the San Antonio Brewing Association, known as the City Brewery. That's now known as Pearl Brewing Company. Early in the history of the enterprise, he became its president. He was also the principal owner of the famous health resort Hot Sulphur Wells that's south of San Antonio. He organized 2 mining operations and a rubber factory in Mexico, as well as serving as president or director of 15 different corporations. According to family legend, Koehler selected as a site for his house a hill overlooking the skyline of the city, which of course included an unobstructed view of his brewery. Sitting on his porch, he could determine whether his employees were hard at work by the color of the smoke issuing from the brewery stacks. Justly proud of their achievement, the craftsmen who built the Koehler house gathered as the project neared completion for a group portrait. Each displayed the tools of his trade. Although the gentlemen standing in the foreground have not been specifically identified, they included the architect Karl von Suter, the contractor Jacob Wagner, and the landscape contractor G.A. Schottenberg. Like their clients, all were of German descent. Before entering professional practice in about 1896, Karl von Suter had worked as a draftsman for James Riley Gordon, the famed architect of the Bexar County Courthouse. G.A. Schottenberg, owner of the Waldheim Nursery in Boerne, Texas, did the original landscaping and provided only the choicest specimens for his friends the Koehlers, who were both avid gardeners. The Otto Koehler residence was touted as the most costly residence in the city at the time, and San Antonio was a good-sized city with a population of over 53,000. Architect and patron alike shared a love of the typically late Victorian showy facade. Forms culled from styles of the past were combined by Suter in more or less new combinations, as was the fashion. The rusticated stone exterior of 310 West Ashby offers many delightful details to arrest the eye. Friezes, Ionic columns, balustrades, as well as Italian Palladian windows were Renaissance elements which provided inspiration for the architect. The massive round arches at the basement level, as well as polygonal turrets, round bays, and asymmetrical disposition of the masses reflect a strong influence of the Richardsonian Romanesque style, which the architect undoubtedly learned from his apprenticeship with Gordon. The romantic notion that the house was inspired by the castles along the Rhine may be borne out by the polygonal roof turrets, which were reminiscent of the onion domes of the German Baroque epoch. The interior spaces cover a total of 12,655 square feet, which is divided between the basement, which has a one-lane bowling alley in it, and the 3 upper floors. An electric elevator, reputedly the first in the Southwest, serves the 1st and 2nd floors. Note the white picket fence that originally defined the property.
In 1911, Mr. Koehler put up this concrete and iron fence that cost $10,000. It was designed by architect Charles T. Bell Howe. Now, this was Mr. Koehler's response to a public campaign to rid San Antonio of fences. The rationale behind the movement was that a neighborhood without fences gave the illusion of a continuous lawn. Reported in the San Antonio Light newspaper of September 20th, 1911, it said, "A property owner who puts up a fence that costs him $10,000 immediately puts himself out of the reach of those down with the front fence agitators."
Alan, welcome to the house that Otto Koehler built. This place has been home to several generations of the extended families of Otto Koehler and his wife Emma Benson Koehler. I'm Margaret Bossart Pace Wilson, and Emma Koehler was my great aunt. The story of our family in this house is typical of thousands of families in this land of immigrants. As one bunch of family prospered, less affluent relatives from the old country were brought to live as part of the household. Otto and Emma Koehler had no children of their own, and there was space aplenty in their new residence. In about 1910, 3 teenagers arrived from Germany. Hetty Kurte, Emma's niece, and my future mother, was accompanied by on the long journey by Otto's nephew and namesake, Otto II, and his brother Charlie. Upon their arrival, the threesome were handed books by Mark Twain and told to learn English. Although they'd studied English in Germany, it was a daunting experience. Frida the cook offered conversation and cookies to reassure the newcomers. Before coming from Munich, Germany to the U.S., Frida had worked in a pretzel factory, so all her cookies were pretzel-shaped. And this is the parlor, which was kept closed except for special occasions: Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter, weddings, funerals, christenings, and birthdays. Otherwise, it was closed. This is the grand entrance hall and the grand stairway on the right. And over here, we have the library where the family gathered. This room was also another gathering place for the family. And the children would sit in the tower room out there. And here's a fireplace that offered a good seating arrangement on each side for the adults to gather in this room. And the library books were over here behind the glass cases. And then next we have the conservatory, which is over here. This is a conservatory, Alan. This is a room that the family always gathered in for breakfast every morning. Mm-hmm. And it was a pleasant place with all these plants around us. And then we have the dining room. This is the main dining room, which saw many a festive occasion and many grand dinners. Now let me show you the Koehler family album. These photographs should help bring these empty rooms to life. This is Emma Benson Koehler on the upstairs south porch overlooking the skyline. Aunt Emma's parents had immigrated from Germany and settled in St. Louis, as did many other German families. This photograph was made soon after the completion of the house. Emma loved to play cards, especially a German game called Scott, which was similar to bridge. The foursome, relatives all, were from the left Antonia Garrels, Hetty Kurte, Emma Koehler, and Elsie Garrels Laska, relatives from Germany and from St. Louis, who came for extended visits with Mr. and Mrs. Koehler. Some of these families moved to San Antonio, where Otto's numerous business enterprises offered employment to the men. This room in which we sit looked this way in 1908. Typically Victorian, notice that the woodwork was then much darker. Also note the Tiffany lamp over the table. On their frequent travels to Europe and beyond, the Koehlers collected furnishings for the house. From such exotic places as Istanbul and Venice came oriental carpets, screens inlaid with jade and mother of pearl, and elaborate serving pieces. This is one of a dozen wine glasses I inherited from Aunt Emma, as well as this Venetian glass bowl. The conservatory provided an environment in which the Koehler's collection of tropical plant specimens would flourish. My favorite was a plant from Mexico that smelled of apricots. The family always took breakfast in this cheerful, light-filled room. The conservatory windows overlooked the lily pond, yet another manifestation of the Koehler's shared interest in gardening. Flower beds brightened the great sweep of lawn, and we knew that spring had come when the northeast corner of the property was blanketed in daffodils. The house was, of course, a perfect setting for the celebrations, and on April 29, 1914, Hetty Koehler married Frank Bossart, an attorney. The ceremony was held in the parlor with guests in the L-shaped entrance hall. In this photograph, the family, including many children, is assembled in the basement bowling alley for the wedding banquet. The bride and groom are seated midway down the left side of a table. And here are my parents, Hattie and Frank Bossart, as newlyweds.
Well, Margaret, this photograph album and your commentary certainly gives us a clear picture of a German immigrant coming to the United States to make his fortune. Mm-hmm. You know, I imagine that his success even outshone his wildest dreams.
I'm sure it did.
Let's now briefly return to our consideration of the development of the neighborhood surrounding the Koehler residence. In tracing the growth of U.S. cities, the fire insurance maps published by the Sanborn's Map Company were invaluable. Each page in the atlas covers only a few blocks. In these two pages from the 1911 edition for San Antonio, the Koehler house appears top center in blue. Also note that the street that's now called Ashby was then known as West San Pedro Place. Because the family owned much of the property contiguous to the Koehler block, it remained undeveloped. However, the area south of Dewey had filled with modest dwellings since the last Sanborn's map was published 7 years earlier. That area is shown in this photograph, made about 1910 from the Atlee Ayres residence at the corner of Belknap and Cortlandt, looking southwest. This is also the future location of the campus of San Antonio College. In another photograph made at the same time and from the same spot but looking northeast, we see Atlee Ayres at the wheel of his automobile. It was among the first to appear on the recently macadamized streets of San Antonio. He was accompanied by his 12-year-old son Robert, while their neighbors, the Terrell sisters, Agnes, Mary, and Elizabeth, looked on. The Koehler carriage house and stables is seen in the background. Otto Koehler also had an automobile and was a member of the Automobile Club, but he continued to maintain horses and to drive his buggy on occasions. One such occasion was the afternoon of November 12, 1914, when Otto drove his buggy to the home of Hedda Burgermeister on Hunstock Street, south of the downtown area. A trained nurse, Miss Burgermeister had attended Emma Koehler, who suffered chronic pain following an injury. She accompanied the Koehlers on one or more of their journeys to the great therapeutic spas of Europe, where Emma sought relief. On that fateful November afternoon, an argument flared, and Nurse Burgermeister fatally shot Otto Koehler. He died a few months before his 60th birthday. She was charged with murder, but jumped bail and fled to her native Germany. 3 years later, she returned to San Antonio to stand trial, stating that the purpose of her flight had been to nurse the German soldiers wounded in World War I. Claiming self-defense, she was acquitted of the charge. So tragedy and scandal intruded upon the seemingly idyllic life in the mansion on the hill. And more trouble was in store. When the United States declared war on Germany in April of 1917, strong anti-German sentiment was aroused, even against U.S. citizens of German descent. In matters economic, the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution had been ratified in 1913. Henceforth, the income tax would make the accumulation of great fortunes more challenging. And finally, Prohibition.
Prohibition put the brewing industry on hold for 13 years. The 18th Amendment came into effect in 1920, which prohibited the manufacture and sale of all alcoholic drinks for common consumption.
That's right. It was a pretty hard 13 years. But life went on. An intelligent and strong-willed woman, my great-aunt Emma, was now head of the household and took an active role in Koehler business enterprises. My birth in 1919 must have brought her great joy. My parents lived in the neighborhood, and many of my childhood memories are of life in this house. Here I am with Emma and a pet on the south lawn. Distinguished visitors from Germany were often guests at 310 West Ashby. In this photograph, made in about 1924, Aunt Emma and I are amused by Walter Jankum, Center, who, with his wife Mitzi Wright, were opera stars on tour in the U.S. My mother, Hetty Bossart, is seated between the Jankums. When Mother and I later visited the Jankums in Berlin, they were also appearing in the movies.
In 1926, construction of Temple Bethel began immediately west of the Koehler House at 211 Belknap. Another spectacular San Antonio landmark, the synagogue was designed by architect Malcolm G. Simons and Karl von Sutter. The land on which the temple was built had been purchased by Emma, who stipulated that the Koehler House architect be a member of the design team along with Simons, who was a member of the congregation of Temple Bethel. When Otto Koehler acquired the land for his house back in 1900, his purchase included surrounding properties. What he probably regarded as a buffer provided to be a good investment.
On holiday occasions such as this Christmas Eve dinner in 1932, the ever-expanding family gathered around this table. Koehlers and Bossarts were now joined by the families of Corin and Olga Priest and Alfred and Grace Garrels. When Aunt Emma needed help after Otto's death in managing the family enterprises, she simply brought in more relatives from St. Louis. Olga Garrels Priest was Emma's niece, and Alfred Garrels was Olga's brother, and they all lived in the neighborhood.
With the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, the Pearl Brewing Company was back in business. In this photograph, Emma Koehler and Brooks McGimsey watches the first bottles of Pearl leave the vats. Emma served capably as president of the brewery and for almost 3 decades, from 1914 until her death in 1943. Initially brought in as an efficiency expert to analyze the performance of the brewery and suggest improvements, McGimsey was so effective that by the mid-30s he was vice president and general manager. This and the next 2 photographs appeared in the Light newspaper in 1933. This photo opportunity was staged for the media at Stinson Field, then San Antonio's municipal airport. To hasten delivery, the first cases of Pearl were loaded into this Curtiss Condor, a passenger biplane.
As soon as the repeal of the 18th Amendment seemed probable, the buildings at the brewery were refurbished and modernized. Notice the reference here to the Alamo. The business survived intact during those 13 years by diversification. The plant produced a popular soft drink called Orange Crush, as well as a 3-2 beer, which was of such low alcoholic content that it was legal. The brewery also filled special orders for regular beer, which was prescribed by physicians for nutritional needs of their patients, usually the elderly. Another profitable venture in those years, before air conditioning, was the manufacture of ice. In 1941, Aunt Emma presided for the last time over a family celebration in her beloved home. The occasion was my marriage. This time the wedding ceremony was held at the First Presbyterian Church, but the reception was held in this house. As you can see, Aunt Emma is greeting guests, and in another picture I'm shown throwing the wedding bouquet from the landing of the grand stairway. At the time of her death in 1943, the United States Army and Germany were once again at war. Otto A. Koehler, the first Otto's nephew, who had made his boyhood home at 310 West Ashby, and his wife Marcia, now assumed ownership of the mansion. Otto II also became chairman of the board and president of the Pearl Brewing Company. But big game hunting was his major passion. Following the death of the second Otto in 1968, the spectacular estate was deeded to the Community College District for use as a Koehler Cultural Center.
Since the early 70s, the diverse needs of the college district and the community at large have been accommodated here, supporting the concept of adaptive reuse of historic structures. The San Antonio College Department of Visual Arts and Technology has until recently utilized the second floor for its exhibition series, while the basement and carriage house continue to serve the instructional needs of the art metals and ceramics programs. For several years, the Koehler also housed the offices and exhibitions of the San Antonio Art League, as well as their annual jamboree. In the mid-'80s, the designer showcase benefiting the San Antonio Symphony was staged here. The Community College District also uses the Koehler for functions, as do organizations and individuals who may lease the facility. As we look to the 21st century, we also anticipate the centennial of the house that Otto Koehler built. A more appropriate adaptive reuse must be defined for this jewel of one of San Antonio's first suburban neighborhoods, overlooking the skyline of the city whose growth and prosperity was linked with that of the builder. In the spring of 1991, a committee of community leaders accepted the challenge to define ways to more fully integrate the Koehler Cultural Center into the life of the college district, the surrounding neighborhoods, and indeed all of South Central Texas. When the redevelopment of the San Antonio College campus is completed, the relationship between San Pedro Park and landmarks in the environs will be emphasized. The Koehler Cultural Center serves as a north terminus of the landscaped area that will sweep southward through the campus. Temple Bethel, with its magnificent brick dome, is encompassed in this vista. The east-west axis of the campus is anchored by the 7-story Moody Learning Center and terminates at San Pedro Park. Recently, the Alamo Community College District joined forces with the City of San Antonio, Via Metropolitan Transit, and other interested organizations to work toward the redevelopment of the San Pedro Park, with the goal of realizing the full potential of this historic park as a valuable and productive urban amenity. With new directions determined and the means to reach these goals marshaled, we will look once more to the heart of this venerable city. Here we will find refreshment, be it social, cultural, intellectual, or spiritual. Because the integrity of the architectural fabric of the Koehler house has not been compromised, and because the surrounding environment, built and natural, is enjoying a renaissance, the future of the past does indeed look bright.